The breeze sweeping through the Blue Ridge Mountains carried a faint, cool edge, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of spring. John Russell stood on the edge of the small, placid lake, his fishing rod in hand. The mountains loomed around them, their ridges a patchwork of budding green and rocky outcroppings. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. John had spent most of his life in Chicago, a place defined by its relentless energy and industrial grit. He worked as a lumberjack in the city outskirts, where the forested preserves offered a semblance of wilderness amidst the urban sprawl. The noise, the pace, and the constant hum of life in Chicago were worlds away from the stillness of this mountain retreat. The fishing trip had been Jake's idea. Jake was the kind of guy who always wanted to escape into nature, dragging his friends along for some adventure or another. Along with Ellie and Mason, the four of them had set up camp near the lake. The day had been spent fishing, swapping stories, and roasting their modest catch over an open fire. As night fell, the wind picked up. It whistled through the trees, tugging at the flames of their campfire. They huddled around the warmth, their laughter softened by the encroaching darkness. "You ever think about how quiet it gets out here?" Ellie asked, her voice low. "Like, too quiet?" "It's just the mountains," Mason replied. "Sound gets swallowed up by the trees." John poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers flare. Something about Ellie's comment gnawed at him. The quiet was oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath. Then it came, the noise. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but deeper, more resonant. It echoed through the woods, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, sitting up straight. John turned toward the direction of the sound, his eyes straining to pierce the shadows. "Probably an animal," he said, though he didn't believe it. Another noise followed, a crashing through the underbrush, heavy and deliberate. It sounded like something large moving through the trees. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Mason grabbed the hatchet he'd been using to chop wood, while Jake pulled a hunting knife from his pack. "Stay close to the fire," John said, his voice firm. The wind whipped through the campsite, carrying with it the faintest whiff of something foul, like rotting meat. Then, silence. The stillness stretched on, broken only by the crackling of the fire. But just as they began to relax, the growl came again, closer this time. And then they saw it. A massive, shadowy figure loomed at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, its shoulders impossibly broad, covered in dark, matted hair. Its eyes glinted in the firelight, reflecting an eerie, reddish glow. "Oh my God," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The creature didn't move, but its presence was oppressive, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. John had never seen or heard anything like it before. He'd heard tales of bears, mountain lions, even wolves. But this was something else. The moment shattered when the creature let out an ear-splitting roar, charging forward with terrifying speed. "Run!" John shouted. They scattered, the firelight swallowed by the darkness as they plunged into the woods. John's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the sound of crashing branches and heavy footsteps behind him. He could hear Ellie screaming, Jake shouting something incomprehensible. Then, a terrible, wet sound. A scream cut short. "Jake!" John called, skidding to a halt. But there was no answer. The creature let out another roar, and John forced himself to move, his lungs burning as he pushed through the thick underbrush. He caught up with Ellie and Mason near a rocky outcropping. "We have to keep moving," he panted. "We can't just leave him." Ellie sobbed. John grabbed her by the shoulders, his voice firm. "If we go back, we'll die too." They moved as silently as they could, the wind masking their footsteps. The creature's growls echoed through the woods, distant but relentless. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell. The wind howled and the forest seemed to close in around them. They stumbled across an old, overgrown trail and followed it, hoping it would lead them to safety. Eventually, they saw lights, a small village nestled in the valley below. Relief surged through them as they hurried toward it, their legs trembling with exhaustion. When they finally reached the outskirts of the village, John collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. A local man emerged from one of the houses, alarmed by their disheveled appearance. "What happened?" he asked. John looked up at him, his eyes haunted. "There's something in the woods, something that shouldn't be." The woods in Maine felt different from the wilderness John Mortensen was used to. He had grown up in Detroit, where nature was more a concept than a reality. Small parks and overgrown lots sandwiched between rows of buildings. But as an IT specialist with a demanding schedule, he found solace in the occasional escape to the outdoors, a contrast to the hours spent staring at screens in dimly lit offices. The rustling leaves and crisp autumn air were a reminder of a world untouched by circuits and code. This camping trip was meant to be a solitary retreat, a chance to unplug and recharge. John had picked a secluded area near an old hiking trail. The trees stood tall and densely packed, their fiery red and gold leaves shedding steadily to form a thick carpet on the forest floor. He spent his days fishing at a nearby stream and reading by the fire at night, the crackling flames his only company. On the third evening, the rain came. It started as a drizzle, pattering softly against his tent, then swelled into a steady downpour. He sat under the tarp he'd rigged above his campfire, staring into the flames. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting leaves was soothing, almost hypnotic, but it was broken by something else, a sound that didn't belong. A sharp crack like a branch snapping underfoot. John froze, his ears straining. The firelight illuminated the immediate area, but beyond it, the woods were an impenetrable black void. He reached for the hunting knife strapped to his belt, the weight of it suddenly comforting. Another sound came, a rustling, deliberate and slow, like something moving just outside the circle of light. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady but laced with unease. There was no response, only the rain and the occasional crack of a branch. He told himself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but something gnawed at him, a primal sense of being watched. Then he saw it. A shadow moved behind a tree, just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, impossibly so, with long, angular limbs that didn't seem to belong to any creature he could name. It didn't move like an animal either. There was an unnatural stillness to it, like it was deliberately waiting. John's mind raced. He remembered an old TV show he'd watched, one of those paranormal investigation series. They talked about strange sightings in Maine, unexplained creatures lurking in the woods, watching from the shadows. He dismissed it as entertainment at the time, but now, staring at the figure behind the tree, he wasn't so sure. The shadow shifted, stepping slightly into the light. John caught a glimpse of its face, or what passed for a face. It was pale and elongated, with deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. A jagged line ran across its head, almost like a scar or a grin. He felt his stomach churn. Without thinking, he grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the figure. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but by the time it reached the tree, the figure was gone. Panic set in. He packed his essentials as quickly as he could, shoving his gear into his pack. The fire still burned behind him, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and stretch in unnatural ways. He decided to leave it. There was no time to put it out. The rain made the forest floor slippery, and the darkness was absolute outside the fire's glow. He moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping the path ahead. Every sound made him jump. The crunch of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the relentless drumming of the rain. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Then the attack came. It happened so fast, he barely registered it. A blur of movement, a heavy impact. He was thrown to the ground, his flashlight skittering away and plunging the world into darkness. The creature loomed above him, its form even more horrifying up close. He swung his knife blindly, feeling the blade connect with something solid. The creature let out a guttural, inhuman scream and recoiled. John scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight and running. His heart pounded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. The creature was behind him. He could hear its guttural breathing, the crunch of its footsteps. He found a dense thicket and dove into it, crouching low and holding his breath. The creature passed by, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stayed there, motionless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When he finally emerged, he moved with painstaking care, his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the woods were still treacherous. He thought of his family back in Detroit, his mother's smile, his father's gruff laugh. He clung to those memories, using them to steel himself. Eventually, he stumbled upon an old dirt road. He followed it, his steps quickening as he saw headlights in the distance. A pickup truck rumbled toward him, and he waved it down, relief flooding him as the driver stopped. "What the hell happened to you?" the man asked, his eyes wide. "There's something in the woods," John said, his voice shaking. "We need to go, now." The driver didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, and John climbed into the truck. As they drove away, he looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of the road, watching. But there was nothing, only the trees, silent and dark. Nick Norris had always loved the open road. As a delivery driver based out of Denver, the expansive skies and winding mountain highways had long been his backdrop. Denver had taught him to appreciate the beauty of nature, but also its unpredictability. He had learned that even a seemingly serene landscape could turn treacherous in an instant, a lesson he would never forget after his journey through Louisiana. The road trip had started as a casual escape, an opportunity to step away from work and the routines of urban life. Spring had transformed the Louisiana bayous into a lush green maze, vibrant and teeming with life. Nick had been drawn to the idea of exploring the deep South, far removed from the chill of Denver's early spring. He wanted to soak in the region's charm, its folklore, and its haunting beauty. By late afternoon, he had ventured into a secluded area near a stretch of swampy woodland. The weather had taken on a dreary cast. Thick clouds hung low in the sky, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. Parking his car near an old dirt trail, Nick grabbed a small pack containing water, a flashlight, a knife, and his phone. Though reception had been spotty since he'd arrived, he told himself it would just be a quick walk to stretch his legs, but the trail seemed to beckon him further with every step. Tall cypress trees rose like sentinels, their gnarled roots twisting into the murky water. The stillness was both calming and eerie. Occasionally, the cry of a bird or the croak of a frog punctuated the silence. Then the silence deepened. Nick paused, a chill prickling the back of his neck. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnatural, as if the swamp itself had stopped breathing. He scanned the trees, the underbrush, searching for the source of his unease. That's when he saw it, or thought he did. Something large crouched behind a tree, partially obscured. Its shape was hard to define, but it seemed hunched, its limbs long and oddly jointed. Nick froze, his mind racing. Could it be a bear? A person? No, it moved differently. Too fluid, too deliberate. The figure shifted slightly, and Nick caught a glint of something. Eyes. They were reflective, almost luminous, and locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. Nick took a step back, then another, trying to convince himself it was just an animal. But as he turned to head back toward his car, he heard movement behind him. Leaves rustled. A low, guttural sound like a growl rippled through the air. His pace quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. By the time he reached his car, night was falling fast, and the clouds had deepened into an ominous gray. He fumbled for his keys, glancing back over his shoulder. The trail was empty, but the sensation of being watched clung to him. Nick started the car and drove to a nearby clearing where he had seen signs for a campground earlier in the day. There, he found a small fire pit and decided to settle in for the night. The idea of driving through the swampy backroads in the dark didn't appeal to him, not with the memory of those eyes burned into his mind. As he lit the fire, the flames cast dancing shadows across the surrounding trees. He tried to shake off his unease, telling himself it was all in his head. To distract himself, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old YouTube videos he'd downloaded. One, in particular, caught his attention, a documentary about unidentified creatures and cryptids. Nick couldn't help but draw parallels between the stories and what he'd seen earlier. Some accounts described creatures that stalked their prey, concealing themselves and watching from the shadows before attacking. He shivered, though the air around the fire was warm. His thoughts drifted to his family back in Denver. His sister had always teased him for being a workaholic, but she would have laughed at his current predicament, probably calling him paranoid. He missed her. Missed their Sunday dinners where she'd try to force him to eat kale salads while he stuck to steak. A sudden snap of a branch yanked him back to the present. Nick's eyes darted toward the sound. The fire crackled, its light failing to penetrate the thick darkness beyond the trees. Then it came, the growl, low, menacing, and close. Nick grabbed his knife, his pulse racing. The growl grew louder, and suddenly the creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, its body impossibly thin yet muscular, its face a grotesque blend of human and beast. Its eyes glowed with that same eerie light, and its mouth twisted into a snarl. Nick didn't wait to see what it would do. He bolted, abandoning the fire and heading toward what he hoped was the main road. The creature pursued him, its movements unnervingly fast. The rain began to fall, soaking Nick as he ran through the swampy terrain. The ground was slick, the roots of trees threatening to trip him with every step. He heard the creature crashing through the underbrush behind him, its growls growing closer. Nick's lungs burned, his legs screaming for relief, but he couldn't stop. Finally, he saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. A small village, or perhaps a gas station. Summoning every ounce of strength, he sprinted toward it. As he broke through the tree line and onto the pavement, the creature stopped. It stood at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes fixed on him. For a moment, Nick thought it might follow, but it seemed unwilling to step into the open. He stumbled into the nearest building, collapsing onto the floor. The locals stared at him, wide-eyed as he gasped for air. "Something's out there," he managed to choke out. No one believed him, of course, but Nick knew what he had seen, and he would never forget those eyes watching him from the shadows.